online, we have people from over 120 countries. And that's why everybody will be making pauses for translations, just like I'm doing right now. Yeah, and with that said, I'm desperately looking forward to what Marie has to say. So Marie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frederick. I think this week we are founding the Revolutionary Communist International, as Frederick said. We want nothing less than to change the course of world history. Our aim is to bring about freedom for mankind through a socialist world revolution. We are communists. We fight for a society without classes or states, without oppression and exploitation. This is not a small task that we have set ourselves. And in order to fulfill that task, we need a theory of history. That is the subtitle of this speech, Historical Materialism, Why We Need a Theory of History. That is why we need to know how history develops, how it changes, and also what role we as communists can play in bringing about that change. Historical materialism is the Marxist philosophy, dialectical materialism, used to study history and to understand history. Historical materialism is not like when you have history in school. I studied history, and you study a lot of events in details, what happened throughout history, but there's no connection. It's just events scattered around in thousands of years of history. Historical materialism is a theory about history and how it develops. It is not about a single event, but about social formations and their development. So when I first was asked to speak on this subject, I got a bit stressed out. Okay, this is all of human history. How will I know, and how will I put it into 45 minutes? And I will not. I think we can do that collectively in the discussion to deepen the understanding of different events and different periods of history. Because of course, as with any other subject, we need to study events of history in details to understand it concretely through this concrete. But we don't have to study them as isolated, unique events, but as part of a larger process. And in order to understand this process, we need a theory of history to understand how it actually develops. But I think it's good to begin with at what point in history do we actually find ourselves now? What stage of history are we passing? Right now, we see elements of barbarism throughout the world, even in the developed capitalist. Even in the richest countries in the world, you have children going to bed hungry. Capitalism finds itself in an existential crisis. And we see this mirrored in a widespread feeling of anxiety and the feeling that the end of the world is near. Worries about climate, war, oppression, cost of living, is just seeping into the minds of the youth. And I would say the majority of young people today are not looking towards the future with joy and excitement about what is going to happen in life, but with fear. And there is this disbelief and questioning of the system. Like when you look at Gaza, I see a lot of memes online being like, how have we come to this? How has the world come to this? But this is not the first time in history that this feeling of the end of the world has been dominating. It is a sign that we live in a stage of history of a socio-economic system that is capitalism that has outlived its historic role. And this feeling that the end of the world is near, and this gloom and doom feeling, we have seen that in the period of ends of all socio-economic systems throughout history. And this pessimism is particularly widespread in academia and on the left wing. They try to theorize it. They see the horrors of the world, but they do not understand it. So they weep and moan and complain. Maybe they are anti-capitalist, they are indignant and angry. They write long articles, but they don't really believe it can be otherwise. They don't believe that society can change fundamentally. But we know that it doesn't have to be like this. We know that it is possible to change society fundamentally. And it is our understanding of history, the historical materialism, that gives us the tools to do it, and that is actually the basis for our optimism. It is our understanding of history that gives us the tools to understand it, and also is the base for our optimism. Throughout history, humans have developed technology, machinery. We have mastered nature to a degree. We have developed the means of production to a level that we can now produce more than enough for everyone on the planet to live a good life. But it requires an end to this system, to capitalism, a system unable to live but unwilling to die. Historical materialism is drastically different from the accepted view of history that you meet in school, universities, and so on. Marx and Engels, they said, the ideas of the ruling class are, in any age, the ruling ideas. And I would say the ideas at universities, even though they on the surface can seem critical or anti-capitalist, they are the ideas of the ruling class. The original ruling idea, the bourgeois idea of history, is that history is the story of great men, of kings, generals, popes, heroes. The battles we see in history are battles over ethics and morals and great ideas. And according to this view, history is merely a series of unconnected random events. There is no change, there is no progress, there are just events that you can study isolated. And this view of history is very convenient for those who defend the present system. They want to present the system that we live in today that as something that has always existed and always will exist. Like if you go to a history museum and you see like some of the depictions of some of the first humans, and you have a mom and dad and 2 kids sitting around a bonfire. Like this is how it has always been, and therefore like how it will always be. For those who don't know, this is not how humans lived in the beginning of human history. But their task, the task of these bourgeois historians, is to preserve the existing order. And that means to use history to justify the present system. And that also means that the more capitalism enters into a historical crisis, an existential crisis, the less scientific bourgeois historians become. Because they have to justify a system that has historically outlived itself. Bourgeois historians cannot be scientific because if they were, they would have to accept the idea that all previous socio-economic systems have ceased to exist, and also this system will. We Marxists, we are often accused of not being scientific. Like my teacher at university in historical method, he said Marxism is a falsification of history. He was a former Stalinist, and that kind of Stalinism was actually a falsification of history. But I would say we Marxists, we strive to obtain the most scientifically exact analysis of social processes. Not in strive of some, how can you say, concept of objectivity, but because we need to understand it as scientifically as possible, because we need to change it. And Marx, he was the first one to put historical understanding on a scientific foundation and to see these events as part of a process. In the last period, it's not so much the old bourgeois historians' view that has dominated at least Western universities. It's more modernist ideas that have dominated not only universities but also the left wing. These ideas can sound radical because they protest against this bourgeois view of history as something that great men, especially men, have done. And they protest against this idea that you learn in school, that progress is these great men and civilization, that is Western imperialism, coming to bring progress around the world and just amid atrocities in the name of progress and civilization. And of course we agree in this protest against glorification of barbarous acts. But as we say in Denmark, I'm not sure if you can say it in English, but they throw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, in some countries you can not say it apparently. Yes, okay. Because they don't only rebel against this bourgeois view, but the core of postmodernism is a rejection of what they call great narrative. The core of postmodernism is that they reject great narratives. That is, they reject the base idea that you can have a coherent theory to understand history. They reject the idea that you can find laws of history, and instead they insist that you should view each culture and each event in isolation and as something unique. And from this follows a rejection of development and of progress itself. And in that sense, even though they can sound quite radical, it is actually as idealistic and as reactionary as the old bourgeois view of history. So we agree in the criticism of bourgeois historians and this idea of the civilizing Western world. But we also reject the postmodernist view. This idea that since we cannot understand history because there's no explanation, there's no grand narrative, and since there's no progress, there's also no point in fighting for radical change in the structures of society. And instead we must just work on individuals and languages. And it leaves us with no concrete way of actually changing the material conditions we live in. And both these views is a very great reflection of the fact that under capitalism, progress has reached its limits. So what is historical materialism? It is the idea that there is a direction to the development of society, that different stages of development have brought us to where we are today, and that the present stage we live in, capitalism, has merely prepared the ground for a higher stage, that is socialism. And with this understanding of history, it not only gives us the tools to understand how we can change history, but also the optimism that we will prevail in changing history. And this is also why we're not utopians. Our idea of socialism and of communism is not something that some great thinker has thought up in the study chamber. It is the idea based on the study of history so far. To see how each mode of production builds upon another and has taken us to where we are today. Yes, I think those who defend the present system, bourgeois and reformists alike, they try to use sometimes the ideas of Darwin, and Marx's ideas of historical materialism came out. He wrote them around the same time as Darwin wrote his ideas of social evolution. And Marx was very inspired by Darwin. But these bourgeois historians and the reformists and the left wing you meet everywhere, they try to say, well, yes, but Darwin showed that evolution happens gradually. And therefore, we should just change society gradually. And therefore, revolutions are either unnatural or will never happen. But as it was discovered later by, among others, Stephen Jay Gould, evolution also doesn't just happen gradually. It happens gradually for some time by what Marxists call quantitative change, until it reaches a point where a species change quite rapidly, qualitatively, into another species, or new species appear. And we see a similar process in the rise and fall of different socio-economic systems. Societies knows long periods of slow and gradual change, but then the line gets interrupted by explosive developments, by wars, by revolutions. And this is the root cause of revolution and development of history, is that one socio-economic system has reached its limit and is unable to develop the productive forces as before. Marx, he explained it, and that's the difficult thing when you do these lead-offs. You find quotes by Marx and you want to say, just read this, because nobody can say it better than Marx. And I found it sometimes a bit difficult with long quotes in lead-offs. So I didn't put it in, but now I decided this morning to take it on anyway. I'm sorry to the translators. Yes, because I think he explains this process very well in the preface to the Critique of the Political Economy. He says, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms with the property relations, within the framework of which they have operated so far. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begin an era of social revolution. And that is the case. You have social formations that develops, peaks, goes into decline, and where the development of the productive forces come into conflict with the superstructure, with the relations of property. And when Engels, he compared Marx's discoveries concerning history with those of Darwin, and that, I think, is the essence of what is historical materialism. He said, just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history. That mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, and so on. And that is what differentiates us from all these other ideas of history. If you want to understand ideas, the state, philosophy, religion of a period, you first of all need to look at how did these people actually live. How did they produce the food that they had to eat? How did they organize production? And this is also what laid the basis for the Marxist, Marx and Engels. They looked at history as different stages of modes of, exactly based on how they produced. Primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, some places is Asiatic mode of production, and capitalism. And this also shows, it goes against, there is this myth that Marxism is just economics, but that's not true. I would say bourgeois history is just ideas and humans, great humans. Marxism is the understanding of the interrelation between the material conditions as the base and the structures, the state, ideas, religion, philosophy, and so on. So I think if we want to understand where we are today and what is the next stage, we first have to look at what has brought us here. And also, by looking at history, it gives us great concrete tools to actually understand the process that are happening today. At the beginning, humans lived in what we call primitive communist societies. The means of production, the way we produced food and so on, it was not developed enough for anyone to create a surplus. There were no material base for inequality, oppression, men and women were equal. And I think that also goes against the argument you hear today. But you communist, how can you dream of this society? Because people are inherently greedy and selfish. It is quite obviously a lie. First of all, there was nothing to be greedy about in the early history of humans. And if they had been selfish, we would have died as a species. They had to cooperate. This argument about human nature, what is considered to be natural human behavior, if you look at history, it changes with the changes in the material conditions. So of course, what is considered greedy and selfish today is based on the fact that we have capitalism, a system based on competition. And again, that is only the ruling human nature. That's the nature of capitalism. If you look at the workers, that is not the human nature of work. But slowly over thousands of years, hundred thousands of years, technologies, tools, and the ways, the means of production were developed to a degree where humans could begin to produce a surplus. And that totally changed human history. It began to make sense to have slaves, because now a slave could produce a surplus beyond what they needed to survive. And thus class society arose. And all kind of things flowed from this. A minority in the top of society rose above the rest. They needed a state, that is, in the Marxist sense, armed bodies of men to protect their wealth. It's a process that we don't have time to go into more deeply here. But Engels describes it in this brilliant book, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State. And also on Marxist.com we have several really, really good articles on this question. For the largest part of humanity, the rise of class society was horrendous. Engels called it the world historical defeat of the female sex. Women became oppressed. For the slaves, obviously it was a barbarous situation. But for humanity, it was a progressive step forward. And I think this is also a key thing. We cannot have a moralistic attitude towards history. It's not like, was this good or bad for the people living in this situation? I would say for most of human history, for most of people, it has been bad, basically. We have to look at things, how they developed, and understand why and where it has taken us. And Hegel, he said, humans developed not so much from slavery as through slavery. On the broad scales of history, the emergence of class society was revolutionary phenomena because it freed a small minority, a privileged section of society, the ruling class, from the direct burden of labor. It freed their minds to think, to develop science, art, culture, philosophy, and thereby to lay the basis for further development of the productive forces. And it was through the development of the productive forces, through that the seeds of class society was laid, but also the seeds for a future classless society. And class society, despite its ruthless exploitation and inequality and brutality, it was the road that humans needed to travel in order to build the necessary material basis for a future classless society. And now we have reached the stage where humanity can return to a form of communist society, not a primitive form, but an advanced form, on a much higher level, because of this immense development of the means of production and this is what we mean by progress. There is progress happening in history. The development of the productive forces that frees human from doing labor. We have reached a point where it would be possible for humanity as such to get their minds freed to actually think, make art, think about philosophy. And that will really lay the basis for a huge surge in further progress. But based on this slave labor, wonderful civilizations were built. A slave society existed in many places around the world. But I would say the peak of slave society was the Roman Empire. I'm not only saying that's because we are in Italy now. But I would say it's here the seeds of civilization that we see today were laid. We can still go to Rome and admire the things that they actually built more than 1,000 years ago. But it is also clear that what we see today are ruins, that the empire crumbled. And that's the law of history, that each different society runs a course of upward trend, reaches a peak and goes into decline because of its internal contradictions. The only real productive class in Rome were the slaves, and therefore built into the Roman Republic was the need for expansion to get new slaves, because human reproduction is not so fast. And that meant costly wars, and also that the empire got stretched over vast geographical space. And also internally, you could say, it reached a limit for further development. If you look at slave labor, there's no incentive for the slave to develop anything or to take care of tools. They were in themselves just considered tools with a voice. And also for the ruling class, there was no incentive to invest the money. They just spend the surplus of the slaves in wars and in luxury. And then it was used also to keep the the proletarians of the Roman Republic quiet with bread and circus. It was former farmers driven from their land, just idling around, not being productive. And what could have taken society forward were land reforms. To give some land to these proletarians, so they were not just living off the labor of the slaves, but actually producing. And there were attempts of land reforms, but they failed. And ultimately they failed because they went against the immediate interest of the ruling class of slave owners of the large estates. And that doomed the fate of the Roman Republic. But I think it's really interesting to see. It was a period of decline of 300 years. I don't know if it was 1 year ago, there was this trend on social media. Ask your boyfriend how many times a week does he think about the Roman Empire? And it was actually quite high. I was a bit surprised. But then when I read this book, Class Struggle in the Roman Republic by Alan Woods, I thought we Marxists should actually think about the Roman Empire a few times a week. Because I think, and that's the thing about historical materialism, we don't just look at history because we think the uniforms were great or it was interesting for the sake of it. We look at it because there are so many similarities to today. We see how this development of a ruling class of slave owners actually is a progressive element in the beginning. But then as society moves forward and begins to go into a decline, their immediate interest goes against what could actually take society forward, like we see today. The Roman Republic, it's not like when a socio-economic system reaches its decline period where it's no longer progressive, it just leaves the scene and say thank you, mic drop. There were hundreds of years of decline, a period with conflicts and with pessimism, and really a period where for many it seemed like the end of the world was approaching. It's not an accident that Christianity, with its idea of the that's difficult to say, the apocalypse and the afterlife became very popular. And if you read, I read some historian from around that time, a monk sitting in Flandern, I think it was. He was like, all these signs that now the apocalypse was very near. And they really believed it. But what was near was not the end of the world, it was the end of the socio-economic system that the Roman Republic was. And what we see in the last period of the Republic was characterized by an intensification of the struggle between the classes, but where neither side was able to actually win a decisive victory over the other. And the result was that the state, the armed bodies of men, began to rise above society. It produced a situation similar to what we today call Bonapartism, but in that time Caesarism. And also, I think it's no coincidence, we're not the only ones thinking about the Roman Republic. I think about a month ago, The Economist had a front page with a picture of Caesar. And the title was, Is America Dictator Proof? Dictator Proof. And actually explaining why the deep state in America should be the bulwark against Trumpism, Caesarism in the United States. So we're not the only ones who can see some similarities. And that's because, again, we are living in a period of history where the existing socio-economic system is in a phase of decline. And we see how the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, has ceased to play any progressive role whatsoever. We see how, as in the Roman Republic, they only care about their immediate interests, to just hoard as much wealth as possible, to actually live in obscene luxury that has no productive purpose, and without any thought about the consequences for the future of humanity in the environment, for example, flying around the world in their private jets and their yachts, and also without any thought about the social consequences. They pursue their own personal interest, and in so doing, they undermine the stability of the entire system, just as in the end of the Roman Republic. When capitalism was in its progressive phase, when the British Empire ruled the world, British politicians and state officials used to think in decades and even centuries. Now they think about the next election or the next opinion poll. They think about their own career, not the country, not even their own party, but just themselves. And that is also a sign that the bourgeoisie can play no progressive role whatsoever anymore. But we are also in a period of time where the working class is numerically stronger than ever, but so far, at the present time, because of the lack of leadership, has not been strong enough to remove the bourgeoisie. And that this deadlock in class struggle, if it is allowed to continue, we are working very hard that this is not happening. But it means that the state begins to rise above society. And that is what the front page of The Economist with the picture of Caesar indicates. And I think the Roman Republic also, Marx and Engels, they said that the class struggle eventually ends either in the total victory of one of the classes or else in the common ruin of the contending classes. And that is what happened in the Roman Empire, the common ruin of all classes in that society. But unlike Rome, today we actually have a way out, and that is the way of socialism. But in the end, it was the internal contradictions that led to the Roman Empire to collapse. These so-called barbaric hordes that invaded the Roman Empire just gave it like the final push. And the rise of the feudal system following the collapse of the Roman Empire was accompanied by a long period of cultural stagnation. In Europe, with the exception of two inventions, the water wheel and windmills, there were no real inventions for about 1,000 years. 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, the only decent roads in Europe were Roman roads. And I would say, if you look at the state of roads today, some of the Roman roads are probably better than those roads. In other words, there were a complete collapse of culture, which was a result of the collapse of productive. And this shows that even though we say progress takes place, it doesn't mean that it's just continually upward trend. History also sees a declining line. And that's really funny, because those who say there are no progress also object to the fact that we say there were no progress in feudalism. But I guess if you don't believe in logic, it's not a problem to have two opposite statements to be true. But slowly, there were development in the feudal system, based mainly on the production by smaller farmers toiling the land. And within feudalism, we saw how the seeds of a new kind of society began to develop. A new money economy started to appear at the margins of society, but slowly undermining the foundations of the feudal economy. And with that came also, as in the end of the Roman Empire, this general anxiety and questioning of the established order and the norms. By the middle of the 15th century, the old system of beliefs began to unravel. People no longer looked to the church as the ultimate speaker of truth. Religious dissension arose in many different forms and served as a guise of social and political unrest. And on the other hand, you saw the church trying to really clamp down and tighten its grip on the minds with the Spanish Inquisition. But you had a period where the old certainties were overthrown and there were extreme turbulence and uncertainty. And again, I think this reminds us very much of what we see today. I don't remember the quote exactly, but Hegel said something like, the reasonable becomes unreasonable. And that is the period we live in, where the old norms are no longer taken for granted. Like, I went to high school in the end 90s. Like, the Soviet Union had just fallen. Democracy and freedom was now had won across the globe. Some even said history had ended. And I would say basically we believed it. There was an order to things. It felt like some kind of stability. But now it is quite clear this is not the case. This idea that we live in the best of all worlds, I don't think a lot of young people believe that. That the West goes out to fight for democracy and human rights across the globe. That we live in a rule-based order and the UN is like pursuing this. That Americans are living the American dream. I think all these established norms of capitalist society is also being completely undermined. And just as in the end of the feudal system, they are a sign that the social system has reached its decline period. And in feudalism, the old feudal restrictions had become unbearable fetters and barriers to further progress. And the new rising class, the capitalist in Spake, early period, began to, rise against it, rebel against it. And we saw a process with a long series of bourgeois revolutions. Revolutions in the name of religion, or in the case of the English Civil War, or reason, as in the case of France, equality, brotherhood, and so on. But to quote Marx from the 18th Brumaire, he said, "And as in private life, one differentiates between what a man thinks and says of himself, and what he really is and does." Yes. And as in private life, one differentiates between what a man thinks and says of himself and what he really is and does. So in historical struggles, one must distinguish still more the phrases and fancies of parties from their real organism and their real interests, their conception of themselves from their reality. I think that is true of the bourgeois revolutions. That's also true for the parties and movements of today. You cannot just judge a party or movement on what they say. You have to look beneath what is the real material class interest behind it. And the main feature in the bourgeois revolutions was to change the mode of production. The old feudal restrictions on economic development were to be removed in order to get free market and the development of industry. To have the dominant form of production, to have produce goods for a market in a free competition. The capitalists became the new ruling class with their private property over the means of production. and the main productive class in society became the workers working for a wage. But I think it's also good to look at this process and think, I don't know if any of you have had this question, but it failed in Russia, so how do you think, hasn't it showed, you attempted and it didn't work. But if you look at this period of history with the bourgeois revolution, it was not like they had one attempt and they succeeded. I think you could ask those who carried through the great French Revolution and saw it followed by Napoleon. So what was the point? What's the point of bourgeois revolution? It just ended in Napoleon. But the French Revolution did not happen in vain. It didn't happen in vain. It changed the material conditions in spite of the political counter-revolution. And it served as the prelude for future bourgeois revolution. Just like the Russian Revolution did not happen in vain, but just left us essential lessons for the future proletarian revolution. But these bourgeois revolutions, they sparked a huge development of the productive forces. Marx said that capitalism can only survive by constantly revolutionizing the means of production. So the development extremely accelerated. So despite the fact that capitalism is the most exploitative and oppressive system, and in the words of Marx, he said, capital came onto the stage of history dripping blood from every pore. It nevertheless represented a colossal leap forward in the development of the productive forces. And it is on the base of all this development of the productive forces throughout human history that we have now reached a stage where humanity can produce enough to finally remove class society. So our idea of socialism, of communism, it is not based on some idea of what could be nice. Wouldn't it be nice if we could all have enough to eat? Yes. Wouldn't it be nice if we could all live in harmony? Well, yes. But we actually have the material conditions for it. But it's also clear that in order to release this productive potential, we need to remove the fetters that are now restricting any further progress. The fetters within the capitalist system that in its beginning were progressive, the private property of the means of production and the nation state, is no longer taking society forward, but is holding any further development back. We no longer have free competition between different companies. We have huge monopolies working on a global scale. Some on the left wing draws this conclusion that then we should go back to the free competition capital. We say it's progressive. It means that we can produce on a vast scale. It means we have social production on a vast scale. We have planning on a vast scale. So it shows how the seeds of the future society is already being built within this society. But we need to remove what holds it back, which is the private property of these companies. And that is the task of the socialist revolution, for the workers to take power and socialize the means of production. And in that way lay the foundations for the abolition of classes and the withering away of the state. And for the first time in history, or at least the first time in thousands of years, to have a society without class oppression and without inequality. Engels said it was something, I don't have the exact quote, but to go from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. We live at a time in history where capitalist system has become more than ripe for its overthrow, and where the conditions for socialism has been created. But it is also clear it doesn't come about by itself. A socialist society doesn't arise from the ashes of capitalism like some phoenix. According to the first words of the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. The motor force of social development is the class struggle. And this brings us to the final question for this lead-off, which is the important part. So what do we do about it? How do we actually change society? And we have to say capitalism has not only created the conditions for socialism, but also its gravediggers, the working class. There are also people in academia that denies the existence of the working class, because a lot of people think they're middle class and not workers. But the Marxist understanding of classes is not a question of what you think you are. It is a question of your objective relations to the means of production. Do you have to sell your labor for a wage? And the great majority of the population today of the world has to do this. And that is also sometimes I think these people, I'm like, but who do you think built this? Who do you think made this? Who do you think bottled your water? Who do you think cleaned the floor? Who do you think take care of your children? Do you not see these people actually existing? Do you think it's fairies running around doing all these things? The reality is that all that is produced today is produced by the working class. That therefore they have the power in society, basically. They can stop working and nothing happens. And because of the way that the working class is being exploited, By the same boss, under similar conditions, the working class develops a collective consciousness, and they has an objective interest in sending the bosses to the dustbin of history. Yes, thank you. And to take over the running of industry through a democratic plan. And it is our task to make this objective interest into a conscious striving. Yes, and a socialist revolution, the workers taking power, it will be the first time in history that it is the majority that comes to power. In all previous class society, it has been a small minority. The slave owners, the feudal aristocracy, the capitalists, the bourgeoisie. And therefore, even on the first day after socialist revolution, it will be a different kind of state, a different kind of society, even though it will be still be a class society. It will be a worker state, as opposed to what Marx called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is, it has gotten a really bad tone to it today. But what does it mean? The dictatorship of the majority as opposed to the dictatorship of the minority, the bourgeoisie today. But through a plan of the economy to develop the means of production, very quickly the social base, depending a bit on where and how the revolution happens and develops, you will have a development of the production forces to a place where classes begins to disappear, inequality begins to disappear, and therefore also the base of the state. And we will move towards what Marx and Engels defined communism as, the state and classless society. I don't know if you can say it in English, but a society where humans can actually be humans. So the question is, how do we come to that? To be a communist is not just about analyzing history and society. It is about bringing this analysis on how society changes into practical use to build the tool that can change society. There is a lot of academics who call themselves Marxists in some way. At least it's becoming a bit trendy. And they're like, I use Marx to analyze society, and I know there are classes. And I'm really critical about capitalism, and I write long books about how bad it is. But Marx said it very clearly himself. He said, I do not claim to have discovered either the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between them. He said, long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this struggle between the classes. My own contribution was, 1, to show that the existence of classes is merely bound up with certain historical phases in the development of production, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that this dictatorship itself constitutes no more than a transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. And I would add not only this, he also took the practical conclusion of that and spent a lot of his time building the revolutionary organization, the First International. So I think if you meet anyone in academia that says they're Marxist, you should ask them 2 things to actually test if they're real Marxists. Do you support the dictatorship of the proletariat? And are you building a revolutionary organization? And unless you're doing that, you're not a Marxist, I'm sorry. And I think this also refutes the claim that is being made against Marxists, that there is no role for individuals in history. And also, why would Marx and Engels build an international if they thought that what they did had no impact on history? It doesn't make any sense. And it is simply not true. And I think you can give many examples that individuals play a role in history. But I want to take one example. And I think it's the greatest event in human history, the Russian Revolution, because it can teach us many lessons on the relationship between the material conditions, the masses, the party, and the individual. First of all, that if you look at Lenin and Trotsky and the leaders of the Bolsheviks, they fought for a revolution in Russia for many years before 1917. It was obviously not up to their willpower to create a revolution. I think as late as January 1917, Lenin said to a meeting of young Swiss socialists that he was not sure to see a revolution in his lifetime. So you can see history is made by humans, but within certain material conditions. Marx explained it like this. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. So revolutions occur when society can no longer play a progressive role, and revolutions occur when society can no longer play a progressive role. When this existential crisis of the system, today of capitalism, drives people to think differently. In normal times, I think, as Alan said, I think it was the day before yesterday, consciousness is rather conservative. You can't live your life if you wake up every morning thinking today will be drastically different than yesterday. You have to live your life a bit like, okay, I get up, I eat the same breakfast I ate yesterday. Maybe I will mix it up a bit, spice my life up and have something different. But basically life is the same. But in certain periods of history, your life cannot just continue as before. You no longer have the money to buy the breakfast you used to eat. Consciousness begins to change. It is undermined, this belief that the world as we know it will exist forever. You have to question one thing and then it begins to question everything. And underneath the surface you have this mood of changes taking place in the consciousness, in the thinking. And at some point, some spark will make these changes burst onto the surface as movement of the workers. And this is what we saw in February 1917 in Russia. The First World War and all it brought with it was just undermining the belief and the conditions of on Women's Day. Sorry. The female workers of Petrograd began to move. They protested the war and its consequences. The strike movement gripped the workers of Petrograd. And within a few days, the Tsarist regime collapsed. And that is also a great lesson. These regimes that we also see throughout the world today, that seem so strong, so almighty powerful. They have like the foundations being undermined. Somebody spoke about the mole, but by the process of revolution, basically, from beneath. And then when the movement begins, it just crumbles. But it is also clear a revolution is not just to get rid of something. It is also a question of what comes in its stead. In order for the revolution to succeed, to become a socialist revolution, and here the role of the Bolshevik Party and Lenin became crucial. It was their work and their role in the period from February till October that made the workers' victory in October possible. And the alternative would have been a bloody defeat. Through the Bolshevik slogan of all power to the Soviets, they showed how the revolution could actually win, how the workers could actually concretely take power into their hands. And with this slogan, the Bolsheviks eventually won the masses to this idea. Because the masses also in practice had the experience that, combined their experience with the meaning of this slogan. They couldn't just have won the masses to this slogan in February. The masses had to go through their own experiences. But how could the Bolsheviks play this decisive role in 1917? Because they had been existing and been tested for years in the years running up to 1917. It was this that made it possible for them to put forward the correct slogan at the right time in 1917, and also for the workers to have tested them before. And in this process also, the presence of the individual Lenin was crucial. There are special times in history where everything is like balancing on a knife's edge, that the fate of history can be decided in a space of a few days or maybe a few hours, like revolutions and wars. And here individuals, the leaders, the generals or whatever, plays a crucial role. In October, when the Bolsheviks were deciding on whether to launch an uprising, there was still some resistance from parts of the Bolshevik leadership. I think many of you know that 2 members of the Central Committee actually protested this decision in the bourgeois press. And it was Lenin, with his organizational and political authority in the party, who overcame this resistance and doubts. It wasn't authority in a military sense, like iron discipline. It was a political and moral authority built over decades of common work, of joint work, where Lenin's ideas and analysis had been tested in practice. He couldn't just have jumped in from the sideline with the correct analysis and then everybody in the Bolshevik leadership would have followed him. He had to be tested in practice. And we have seen this crucial role of individual and leaders being shown to be correct also in the negative sense throughout history, in more or less probably all other cases than the Russian Revolution. One of the more tragic ones is the German Revolution of 1918-1919, where the Communist Party had not been formed and tested years before the revolution. In November 1918, workers' and soldiers' councils just sprung up all over Germany, but there were no revolutionary party. The German Communist Party were not formed until a few months after, on New Year's 1918-1919. And within a few weeks of its existence, its 2 main leaders, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were murdered, and the revolution ended in a bloody defeat. But think what the world would have looked like if they had succeeded. The course of world history would have changed. The resources of Russia, combined with the technology of German industry and the skills of the German working class, it would have meant that the Soviet Union would have started on a qualitatively different stage of development. most likely the bureaucratic degeneration of the Russian Revolution under Stalin would have been avoided. Socialism would have been an even greater pole of attraction for workers all over the world than it already was. And we would probably have been living now with 100 years of socialism. We would have avoided all the horrors of the Second World War, Holocaust, all the subsequent wars, the starvation, destruction of the climate, and so on. This is the role of individuals. This is the importance of individuals. Marx said, history does nothing. It is men and women who make history. And history shows us that the presence of a revolutionary party is crucial in a revolutionary situation, and that within this party, the leadership is crucial. That means it needs a strong cadre base who have studied history, who has learned the lessons and understood how to actually change society. And that is why we need a theory of history. Trotsky said, the genius of Lenin was expressed in the fact that he pioneered new historical methods. And I think it's important also to have some sense of proportion, but I think some of you will maybe sit and think, but I'm not Lenin. And none of us are. And we have to remember the Bolshevik party was built by thousands and thousands, of whom most of them remain nameless today. They were revolutionaries, and without them, the revolution would not have succeeded. Lenin could not have done this without the existence of the Bolshevik party. So a little bit less than Lenin can do. But Trotsky, he once described that the first duty of a revolutionary is to understand the causal sequence of events and to find somewhere in the sequence one's own place. And that is the duty of all of us, to understand the events that are taking place and understand what role we can play in this. It is through this understanding of history that we can act to change it. We cannot go beyond the material conditions. No matter how much we want to, we cannot create a revolution. But from our understanding of the present time of history, we understand that the masses will move, and they will move quite likely in the very near future. And when they do, the existence of parties, a party is made up of individuals, plays the crucial role in whether this movement will succeed or not. And that is why we are building the Revolutionary Communist International, because we believe this will make the qualitative change in the struggles that are lying ahead. The party does not build itself. It is built by individuals. It is built by communists who decide to spend our energy in fighting for a better future for humanity. It is built by you and me. And in that sense, we all have a small particle of the fate of world history on our shoulders. It is up to us, comrades.
Thank you, Marie, for this wonderful introduction. And we will soon have a short break where you will have the chance to lay your hands on these wonderful treasures, which I think, as Marie explained very well in her lead-off, they won't only allow you to understand the laws underpinning human development in general, but they will allow you to understand the society that we live in. They will allow you to understand the laws underpinning the revolutionary processes that we are part of. This book, for example, that Marie recommended very well, on the class struggle of the Roman Republic. If you're watching online, you go to wellreadbooks.com and you buy it straight away. And you do what I did during my entire high school years. You annoy your history teacher to the maximum, because what he's saying doesn't make sense. You know, Caesar came and then the Roman Republic ended. History doesn't really work like that. Here you actually get the real process, and you will learn how this process develops. And this knowledge you can use. You get this book, this wonderful book by Engels, which busts every myth that the bourgeois puts forward about our current society by explaining that class society didn't always exist. Women's oppression didn't always exist. The state didn't always exist. And you learn how all of these phenomena was developed, and of course how we can smash them. That book would have to be complemented by this issue of the In Defense of Marxism, which uses modern research to pinpoint dates and facts and a lot of stuff which Engels didn't have access to. Actually, there are several issues of the In Defense of Marxism magazine that really goes through these processes really well. There's, for example, another one which explains how class society arose. You have this wonderful introduction to historical materialism and what is Marxism, which I think that should be the first read for everybody that wants to take on this subject. And then actually every single book that we have about whatever revolution in history that you read, you will see how these laws play out in reality. And well, we're gonna have a 20-minute break now. Everybody that wants to intervene during discussion, come see me during the break. And if you have any questions, also come see me during the break. So be back. We're going to start again at 20 past 11. Thank you. I'll see you then. So welcome back, comrades. We have a really packed discussion now. First of all, for those of you watching online who couldn't buy books here in Italy, somebody told me to tell you that when you go to wellreadbooks.com, there's a dash between well-read and books, just so that you find the website. And for all those of you who are going to make all these wonderful interventions now, a reminder to make it easy for the translators. That means speak very clearly and with short sentences. The first speaker will be Mark from the US section of the RCI, and he will be followed by Joel.
I want to talk about perspectives. Perspectives I think we can think of as the live stream of a historical materialist analysis. We use the Marxist method to develop our perspectives, to get a sense of where the class struggle is moving. Is the working class tired, dejected, or temporarily on the retreat? Or is it emboldened, angry, and ready to go on the offensive? And you can take broader, perspectives on this as well, longer periods, shorter periods, etc. And it's based on this analysis that we develop our battle plans, how we plan to develop our own forces, raise our profile, grow, and sink roots in the working class. How we plan to develop our own forces, raise our profile, make ourselves more aware, and grow and sink roots in the working class. Without historical materialism, other political tendencies are entirely blind. They take a snapshot of the present and draw all their conclusions from that snapshot. They take a snapshot or photograph of the present and draw all their conclusions from that snapshot or photograph. Trotsky has a phrase that I'm very fond of. To describe these people, he said that they're worshippers of accomplished fact. They don't look at the social forces in their movement and change, where they came from and where they're going. As Maria said, it's all reduced to ideas and great individuals. And then on the other hand, unlike the Stalinists, we don't rigidly look at the economics as the automatic transmission belt to the social and political. They used this version of historical materialism to justify all their anti-revolutionary policies. The conditions aren't right, the working class isn't ready, etc. We don't discount the influence of ideas and individuals. We know they can play decisive roles in history, provided that those individuals and their ideas actually correspond to the conditions that are ripe for them, provided that those individuals and their ideas correspond to the conditions that are ripe for them, ready for them. So with historical materialism, we can judge with more or less accuracy where things are heading. And that's why we always have to remind people that we don't have a crystal ball. But it doesn't stop there. As Marx said, philosophers have interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And that's where we step in, as the subjective factor of history, building and preparing for the great events ahead, and conquer the masses as the Bolsheviks did, by developing a program that can transform the world and corresponds to the interests of the working class. And once the ideas of Marxism and our program grasp the masses, these ideas can become an unstoppable material force in society, sweeping all before it. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Now it's Joel from the Canadian section, and after Joel, it will be Ubaldo.
So with postmodernism infecting the universities, it's open season for historical materialism. Any student of history or social sciences will know. If you mention something like progress, development, or talk of historical stages, people act like you did something really bad. However, when you discuss with people like this, the striking thing is it's not so much that they have a theory, it's that they are anti-theory, that they object to a theory describing development, which they call like meta-narratives. So yeah, in the fall of 2021, there was a book published which tried to provide a sort of new theory of history. Yeah, this book was called The Dawn of Everything. And one of the authors, there was two authors, and one of them was the late David Graeber, who's a well-known anarchist anthropologist. So yeah, the main, thesis of this book is that materialist explanations for historical development rob us of our humanity. So they attack, explanations about the mode of production or the level of development of the productive. And if you try to use those things to explain how this determines the makeup of society, you're robbing us of our humanity. So yeah, their theory is supposed to restore our ancestor, real humanity, and rediscover our starting with liberating our minds from materialism. Yeah, so connected to this, they argue that humans can choose their social structure regardless of modes of production or development of the productive forces. Yeah, so they claim therefore there are no laws that govern historical development, just the ones that we make up ourselves. But as Lenin said, Marxism is powerful because it is true. The laws of historical development that Marie laid out are not arbitrary things imposed on society, but they're the general trends that have been observed through a detailed study of history. So in this book, they're in trying to disprove this, they engage in this kind of method of picking outlier examples in an attempt to disprove the general, which is a common thing with postmodernists of all types. Yeah, so they pick a few indigenous groups from North America, hunter-gatherers, who changed their social structure based on the seasons, try to argue, therefore, mode of production doesn't matter. But all this proves is that these groups were modifying their social structure with the direct material conditions. And this in no way disproves that there's various stages of development. So as funny as it may seem, this anarchist is trying to disprove that we have a stage of primitive communism in our past. They actually claim that if you argue that, you're infantilizing early humans. Let's think about that argument for a minute. They're basically saying, unless we have slavery, kingdoms, class exploitation, and the state, you're a child. So they claim that these things have always existed for all of humanity. And in typical idealist fashion, they say things like, hunter-gatherers have lots of kings in their minds. They just don't let them take human form. Like, okay, they have kings in their heads. Yeah, this is a common thing, the boiling down the origins of phenomenon to ideas. Similarly, they claim that private property has always existed. Yeah, they say this, if private property has an origin, it is as old as the idea of the sacred. So the argument is primitive communist hunter-gatherers believed that everything was owned, which they generally did. So they say, therefore, they believe in private property. But they didn't believe that in private property. They believed that a great spirit owned the lakes, the rivers, the mountains, and therefore no one could own it. This was against private property. Yeah, they quote this indigenous leader, Canadian indigenous leader, who the French actually used to invite to Montreal. This is like 400 years ago, because he was very smart and they liked to debate him. And yeah, the shocking thing about his arguments is they're surprisingly materialist. Yeah, that the French governor would say, well, you backwards people, you need to learn civilization, and this indigenous guy would respond like, what kind of civilization is this, where everyone's poor, you have rich and poor, you have people exploited, you have prisons, you have police. And he says the reason why you have these, because you have separate material interests, things like money, nobles, concepts of mine and thine, private ownership. But again, this is not surprising, because this indigenous guy came from a primitive communist society. So quite often with these types of postmodernists, the examples they use prove the opposite that they're trying to prove. Yeah, and you get the profound, you get this feeling that they're just trying to fit the facts into their theory. So yeah, Marxism is generalizations about history. Yeah, we look at the broad sweep of history and you notice trends. There are always outliers within the broad trend. Nothing fits nice and neatly into the categories. When you take a step back and you look at the big picture of historical development, there's clear stages of development. Yes, and they're connected to various modes of production, which determines the general. So this book, in attacking some of these fundamental ideas, actually makes it impossible to understand anything. So in their drive to restore us to our real humanity and make us more free, it actually does the opposite. It makes us less free. Because yeah, what is freedom? Freedom is not a rejection of the laws. I don't like that. I don't think the mode of production has anything to do with it. Well, you might not like that. That's a fundamental fact in historical development. And more importantly, it's a fundamental fact today, which is why all attempts to change society without changing private ownership of the means of production ultimately lead to failure. Yeah, so I think discussions like this are extremely important for us, not just looking at history, but fighting for a new world today. Yeah, so we can really understand the laws of it and understand why our society is the way it is and what we need to do to change it, which is not to liberate our mind from materialist explanation. Change the material foundations of society, change the mode of production, so that for the first time, we'll be able to control the means of production and determine our future. Yeah, and that's real freedom, and that's the way to return to restore our humanity.
Thank you, Joel. Next speaker is Ubaldo from the Mexican section of the RCI, and after Ubaldo, it's Stan.
Understanding history is not just an intellectual matter, but rather our political project and our perspective for the struggle flows from this. For example, Stalinists, Even though they relied upon the economic superpower, they weren't able to develop Marxism, but rather they turned it into empty formulas, just in order to justify their political line. For example, in Latin America, they said that after the conquest, what had been established was feudalism, and therefore the next stage would be a capitalist revolution. And the task of the communist parties in Latin America was to support the progressive bourgeoisie. And therefore, they had to renounce the seizure of power in those countries. This is not what this talk is about, but this is what gave rise to guerrillism and other such deformations. Decolonialism uses this analysis of Stalinism to say that they reject the linear analysis of Marxism, that Marxism can't understand the reality of Latin America because it's more complex than that. Decolonials, the academic strand that's known as decolonialism says that they are materialists, they base themselves on materialism, but they're not dialectical materialists. They reject dialectics because they say it's a European term that doesn't apply to Latin America. So what does this mean? They reject the thread that underpins all development. They present history as isolated facts, which actually leads to a pre-Marxist thought. They say that when the Spanish arrived, there were other modes of production that hadn't been abolished by capitalism, that they couldn't all be added together and bring a modern capitalism to Latin America, and that therefore the makeup of the Latin American state, that it's a failed state because it cannot impose a culture, because in a lot of these Latin American peoples, they still have communal forms, and that they're not even able to impose a common language because all the languages, the native languages, are still there. And that's why they say that the laws of Marxism that analyze capitalism don't apply to the Americas. And so the conclusion is that because capitalism isn't dominant, then the working class is not the progressive class. According to them, the revolutionary subjective factor are the peoples that weren't conquered, which in theory are the native people. So what does Marxism say about this? First of all, just to say there's something we haven't really studied too much, which is the combined and uneven development, which is a very important part of historical materialism, which allows us to understand the dynamics of integration of all these countries that didn't have a bourgeois revolution and that were subsumed and incorporated into global capitalism. When the Spanish arrived to America, or rather before the Spanish arrived, you had varying degrees of development within the continent. There were very strong nation states like the Inca or the Aztecs, but there were also communities that were based on common assemblies. The big cities had the political power but also control of the land, whereas in some small villages you had common ownership of the land. When the decolonial academics talk about how beautiful these pre-capitalist forms were in Latin America, they never explain which of these societies they're referring to. Are they talking about the big empires which carried out wars and were extremely brutal against these other smaller societies? Or do they talk about those small communities where you did have communist societies, but were isolated and that you only had these communal forms within the isolated villages? With the arrival of the Spanish, you had the arrival of a different mode of production, but you actually had two modes of production. The Spanish crown, which was based on feudalism, but the motor force that was actually driving to the conquest of the Americas was mercantilism, the nascent bourgeoisie. And so it was a very chaotic process. There were political forms that were semi-feudal. In other areas, you had a process of industrialization tied to mining, and therefore that was basically like capitalist exploitation. But you also had still tributary forms of exploitation, which were the forms of exploitation that existed before the Spanish arrived. So which of those is the dominant force? It was definitely capitalism. All the other pre-capitalist forms of production were incorporated into the general capitalist mode of production. This also happened in the United States. And Marx wrote about this, about the slave ownership in the South. And Marx says that this is not a capitalist form of exploitation, but it's basically just incorporated into how capitalism is developing in the continent. Capitalism had arrived, but there was an uneven development of the productive forces. And all the other processes of production were merged into this emerging capitalism. And it's through the theory of uneven and combined development that we can have a coherent understanding of the development of capitalism in the Americas. It would be really stupid to say today that this is not a capitalist economy, Although it's true that the national bourgeoisies are extremely weak and inept. And they're very cowardly, and they cannot play an independent role from imperialism. Our task in Latin America and in the post-colonial countries, it's the socialist revolution. There is no other way out.
Thank you. Now it's Stan from the British section of the RCI, and after him, Jules.
So in Italy, during 1848, very vivid theory of permanent revolution. There were brave, heroic uprisings, Milan and Venice. Is this better? Okay. But I would like to discuss the short-lived Roman Republic. The Italian bourgeois revolutionary movement. Or as it was known, the Risorgimento, went through a prolonged, drawn-out process. For instance, in Italy, where the ideas of the Enlightenment, the Renaissance and early capitalism emerged first, it took centuries for it to complete its bourgeois revolution. I don't have time to fully explain this process, but the Roman Republic in 1848 to 49 sheds light on this general process. When Pope Pius IX was elected in June 1846, he gradually granted progressive democratic reforms. As Engels said at the time, the man who occupies the most reactionary position in Europe and represents a fossilized ideology of the Middle Ages, the Pope has placed himself ahead of the liberal movement. Over time, these reforms led to uprisings everywhere, demanding further reforms from the Pope. But realizing his mistake, the Pope tried to pacify the movement, and he abandoned the struggle as well for national unification. But he merely opened up a new phase of political crisis. And in November 1848, amidst assassinations and terror by the popular mobilization, he fled Rome. And it was declared a republic by a new constituent assembly. The Italian Republican and radical Giuseppe Garibaldi participated in the defense of the republic, and Giuseppe Mazzini, bourgeois Republican, was a leader of the republic. Although Garibaldi had fantastic qualities as a military leader and inspired thousands to join him for the national liberation of Italy, he neglected the problems facing the broader movement. And as for Mazzini, he was impregnated with class collaborationist ideas. His theory aimed to establish a liberal bourgeois democracy that offered political rights to workers in order to preserve the privileges of the middle and upper class. Pope rallied French troops to smash the Republic. Siege of the city lasted 5 months, and the bombardment of Rome was fierce. Revolutionaries came to the defense of the Republic from all over the world, and the days of the siege were characterized by the heroism of the popular defense to the popular participation to defend the Republic. During the siege, for the first time, saw red flags flying from the barricade. However, Garibaldi, he had dangerous illusions. He was prepared to provide support to the reactionary monarchy, the monarchy of Piedmont, if they were willing to join the defense of the Republic and fight for a united Italy. But Piedmont had already betrayed the revolutions in Milan and Venice, and it was clear that only the oppressed masses could achieve his aims. And it was clear that it was only the oppressed masses that it could achieve Garibaldi's aims. All the tendencies and their limitations came to the surface during the Republic, and the bourgeois and petty bourgeois were too weak to lead the struggle. But the early socialist tendencies, they were also too weak to rescue the Republic. Mazzini and Garibaldi were incapable of carrying forward the struggle for national liberation and unity on a revolutionary basis. But from the ashes of this experience, we can see the first Italian socialist tendencies emerge. Sadly, isolated and with enemies gathering on all sides, the Republic was eventually defeated in July 3rd, 1849. Now for Marx, historical materialism, which he had already developed, was only deepened and strengthened by the revolutions of 1848. And in Italy, this was a very stark proof of his theories. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jules from the French section of the RCI, and after that, Leire.
Okay. I wanted to talk about a particular trend in French historical research. That is the Annales school and its decay. At the beginning of capitalism, bourgeoisie historians were convinced that progress was real and that capitalism was making it go forward. But as Marie explained, as capitalism entered crisis, most of its historians rejected the very idea of progress. Because if history have laws and if progress is real, it meant that bourgeoisie is doomed because its own progress is weakening class domination. But this rejection of progress was not a one-sided process. After the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and with the huge influence of Stalinism, some historians were influenced by these events and turned to what they think was to the left. In France, this trend took the form of the Annales schools, from the name of their paper, Annales, story, which dominated French historical research from the 30s to the 70s. Breaking with the previous historians, they concentrated themselves on the study of socio-economic structures and the life of oppressed classes. They also introduced new methods of research. For instance, during the 30s, they conducted massive campaign of research with thousands of students and amateurs helping research life of medieval peasants. But as I said, they were mostly influenced by Stalinism. And this meant what they thought as Marxism was not. Their ideas were in fact a mechanist mixture of Stalinist deformations and of the old positivist ideas of the 19th century. This led this school to a dead end. They were totally unable to explain what happened during the 60s and 70s with the big revolutionary wave under their own eyes, that they generally tended to reduce to a movement of only students and intellectuals. And they were also unable to explain the failure of Stalinism. All this led them to dissolve, ultimately, into the next academic trend. That is the postmodernist reaction that followed the 70s revolutionary wave. With this new trend, they abandoned all attempts to find laws governing human history, and some of them even denounced the idea of causality as unscientific, which for an historian is something a bit silly, to say the least, to be polite. During the 80s, this gave birth to a new postmodernist school, the microhistory, which explained that classes, masses, big events, or large social structures were irrelevant, and that historians should concentrate on studying isolated individuals. It was in fact a direct transposition of individual subjectivism into historical research, in fact, and this led nowhere. For instance, some of them went as far as erect the middle-aged recluse women. The recluse, I will explain. Some of them went as far as describe the recluse women of the Middle Age as an example of women liberation. These women were shut in small cells with no daylight, praying all day for months or years. But for some of these postmodern intellectual historians, they were free because in their small shut-in cells, no one could oppress them. This kind of ideas has nothing progressive to offer. It is obvious, I mean. Today, the bourgeoisie has renounced to explain and understand human history. Today, the bourgeoisie has renounced to explain and understand human history. But we haven't. We study it armed with the ideas of historical materialism, authentic ideas of Marxism, not those of academic Stalinism. And we study it, as comrades said, to understand how to overthrow this decaying. Thank you, comrades.
Thanks a lot. Last speaker for today will be Leire from the Spanish section of the RCI.
Okay, hey comrades. I was researching about historical materialism, and I found this great article called Marxism, Materialism and Art, which I really recommend, and also everything that Trotsky has written on art. The thing is, capitalism tends to split up science and art, when in reality art can help us much to learn about history, science, everything. So, like everything, we know that art is clearly rooted in a certain historical context. I mean, the environment matters, even though they try to make us think that art is something like detached from reality. Art contains life. It cannot solely be a reflection of the spirit of an author or a way of self-expression. That would mean that great artists come like out of the blue, but every artist, if you think, is a product of their time. Because if we analyze this closely, it's clear that art is definitely linked to the development of the forces of production. Artistic movements rise and fall all the time, and it's been said, but that can only be explained through social and historical factors, not individual ones. Dialectics are applicable to art as well. So the function of art keeps changing as the world itself changes as well. Marx said that art is conditioned by time in history. Art is a moment in humanity, but at the same time that every piece of art is influenced by the reality of a particular historical moment. Art can go beyond its epoch and can connect with humanity as a whole. So we can say that art links the particular to the universal. It is true that art is really old, and even primitive art was seeking some kind of meaning. Yes, it is true that art is really old, and even primitive art was seeking some kind of meaning. But I will not speak on that. I think what is key to understand the relation of art to history is the fact that because of the emergence of economic surplus and division in class, the leisure class started to have time to produce and develop art on a greater scale ever. But with the rise of capitalism, it becomes more evident that division between, let's say, fine arts for a pure self-expression and, in the other side, entertainment for the general public. Because of the monopolization of artistic industry, we see that both fine arts and mass culture respond to the tastes and material interest of the bourgeoisie, which is profit, of course, and their individualistic and idealistic view. So capital is now hostile to art. And we see the decline of bourgeois society, which is an inevitable obstacle to the development of art and every aspect of society. There is no content, just focus on the form, emptiness, because we have a social form that doesn't fit anymore with the needs of society. Changes both in content and form happen because of economic and social changes, because of revolution that makes it go forward. So it is clear that we need a revolution, but we cannot solve this with art itself or cultural ideas themselves. Trotsky said that art cannot save itself in the middle of an economic, cultural, social crisis. And, well, of course, art can play a role in there. But Trotsky said, and he was right, that revolution in general acts as the locomotive of history. Revolution could give everybody access to art and culture. Human development is endless, and art will not make that for us. So it is our duty as revolutionaries to put an end to a system that cannot develop anymore, to a system that makes no room for art, for culture, to a system that benefits from the lack of freedom. So revolution will make art and life one and the same, and we revolutionaries can take the destiny of history in our hands if we organize. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, everybody, for enriching this really important discussion. I think every intervention has been really concise and really profound. On this last intervention, the next issue of the In Defense of Marxism magazine is going to be precisely on Marxism and art, which I think is extremely important, and it will help us all to expand our horizons, I think. I'll soon hand over to Marie to sum up. After lunch, there will be 3 sessions. One will be on Marxism and on War and Revolution. That will be in the main theater. Another will be on World Revolution or Socialism in One Country. That will be in here. And the third will be on Does Communism Mean Bureaucracy, which will be in the gazebo. So, Marie, you now have half an hour to sum up.
Thank you. And thank you for a really excellent discussion. I think for many people, when you hear the word history, you get a bit tired. I studied history, and I myself, when I open a history book, I just fall asleep. Most of them are so boring, because they just pile facts upon facts. Actually, often when I have to study some new area of history, I begin by reading a biography, because it gives me something personal to relate all these facts to. But I think this session shows that history is only boring if you look at it in the bourgeois way. history and historical materialism really is the essence on how to change society and how we live life, humans. And also, I think this showed the intervention by Stan that historical materialism is a theory about history. We still need to study the events, to give the theory, what do you say, life and flesh, you say in Danish. I don't know how to say it in English. I think it was Lenin who was very fond of quoting Goethe, and now I will quote it, who said something like theory is grey, but life is evergreen. So we need to study life. And also in order to understand now, if you have 45 minutes like I had, it has to be very broad and very general. And that is like the caricature of Marxism is like it's this mechanical way of looking at history. And when you have to explain it in 45 minutes, it becomes a bit mechanical. Sorry. And I think this caricature comes from the Stalinists. Just like every other ruling stratum just like we see the bourgeois historians today, the Stalinist historians had a need to use history to justify their own privileged position in society. As Ubaldo said, they had no interest, they couldn't really develop Marxism because they needed theory to justify something static and stable and not in its development. So I can understand why there is this tendency to reject Marxism if you think it's this mechanical idea. Because history and life is more complicated than just the 5 stages that all human societies have to go through. But Marxism is not mechanical. We are dialectical materialists. So when we talk about these stages, this is very broad generalizations. And it doesn't mean that every society needs to go through the exact same stage or will go through the exact same stage. Quite the opposite. The whole basis of the theory of the permanent revolution, the theory put forward by Trotsky that actually explained what happened in the Russian Revolution, is this idea that Ubaldo also mentioned, and I didn't have time to go into it in my lead-off, but I think it's very important for the comrades. This idea of uneven and combined development. And this is very important, not just for the sake of understanding, but exactly for what tasks do we have in the previous, especially in the former colonial countries. What task do the revolutionaries have? It's a practical question, not just a theoretical question. And what is this idea? It is with the development of capitalism and therefore development of imperialism in one part of the world. This determines the development of the rest of the system. They colonize by weapons and by finance the rest of the world. And therefore, the former colonial countries cannot go through this long process of primitive accumulation, building up capitalism and a national bourgeoisie as the original capitalist countries. Therefore, the national bourgeoisies cannot play the revolutionary role that the bourgeoisie played originally in the bourgeois revolutions in Europe. They cannot carry out what we call the bourgeois task of implementing democracy, national unification, and so on. And because you have finance just running around all over the world investing, they built like huge factories, like in Russia in 1917. There were huge factories. The how do you call that? Sometimes English. Also a colonizing language. Thousands of workers were just put together in these huge factories, actually more workers than in many factories in the US or in Britain. So you had this combined development of feudalism existing in the countryside and these huge concentrations of workers. And the bourgeoisie in Russia, it couldn't play a progressive role because it was bound with thousands of threats with the old aristocracy and with foreign capital. And they were afraid to mobilize the masses, as was actually the case in the former bourgeois revolution. It was not just the bourgeoisie who were fighting in the streets of Paris. So the only progressive force in Russia in 1917, as in all colonial countries today, or not progressive force, the only force in society that can actually carry through a revolution is the working class, leading the poor masses and the poor peasants behind them. But the working class cannot stop at the bourgeois revolution. What is a bourgeois revolution? Equality, but it's equality before the law and extreme social inequality. So the working class, it doesn't stop here. They want social equality. That can only be carried through a socialist revolution. And in that sense, the revolution is permanent. And it's also permanent in the sense that capitalism has created a system of global production. You cannot create socialism, therefore, in one country. You can hear more about this afternoon. In here, I think. The revolution needs to be permanent also in the sense that it needs to spread internationally. That is why we are building a revolutionary communist international. Yes. Just a few points before I come to the end. First of all, I think there is this tendency of glorification of the past. Right now in Denmark, for example, I don't know how it is elsewhere, there is this idea of going back and looking at witchcraft as a way of empowering women. Or this idea that Schulz mentioned, which is, that's so obviously just reactionary, about women being locked in. And I can understand the urge to do it. Because if you look at now, it's horrible. There is so much pressure, especially on women. So you can look back and think they led a simpler life, a happier life. But I probably wouldn't be here now. I'm 43. And I have given birth. There's a big chance I would have died. I'm quite happy about hospitals and medicine. Yes. So we do not look backwards, we look forward to what is actually possible. And also understand, like, it's also this tendency of trying to, also this micro history, or in Danish it's something like, I don't know the English word, but like remembrance history. You go and ask people for their personal story. Also sometimes as a feminist project to bring out women in history. And I can see the point, and I think it's interesting to figure out how did people live, what did they think, even those who were not king, who actually normal lives. But if you stop there, you do nothing. You just, okay, they live like this. So why don't we live like this anymore? And how do we want to live? And also, it's this, but why don't you, we also hear it as Marxists, but why don't you have more, why don't you use more female theoreticians? But that is really not understanding the material conditions of women throughout history. There is an element of history being written by men, and therefore they forget powerful women throughout history. That is an element. But there is also the fact that clever women had to be witches and not kings and helpers to the king. Virginia Woolf, the British author, she wrote a book called A Room of One's Own, explaining how if you are everyone, but if you are a woman, you need a room to go if you want to write, create art. Now I have a kid, and I would say it's not just a room, it's time of one's own. If you are to think, you have to have time. Not cooking, not cleaning, not making laundry. Most women throughout history has been robbed of this opportunity. And we are fighting to change this. Because we know that the lack of theoreticians, female theoreticians and historians throughout time is not because women are more stupid, but because they did not have the material conditions, they did not have the free time that was given only to the ruling stratum of society. And I want to end on this, that I think is very, very important. This that Leila spoke about, I really like the intervention. And I think it's connected to also what Joel spoke about. Joel said Graeber and his thinking says that the materialist explanation of history robs us of our humanity. But it is exactly what Joel said. It is through our understanding of our materialist conditions that we can actually act to free ourselves from them. We become free by knowing necessity. We can make airplanes because we understand gravity. And I think this is really what is this about? What is this fight for communism about? What makes us human? We have material needs we need to have covered. We cannot function without food, and I think a lot of us is feeling it right now. It is close to lunch. We need shelter, we need all these things. That is the basis. But what took humanity forward was when humanity as a collective could produce a surplus big enough for a small section of the population to be free to think, to create art, to think about philosophy, science. And I agree they are all connected. What is, I don't know if I would say essence, but what is in all human beings? It's creativity. And throughout history, for the majority of people, the creativity of humans have been completely squashed. It has been the privilege of a small minority to actually be free to think. And we see now how the degeneration in this system degenerates all culture. It goes for art, but it also goes for human relations. People don't have time to see each other or to help each other. They just have to struggle to keep on going on with their daily life. We have a system where we are developing AI, and what does it do? It creates art, while the majority of us are still folding laundry. Why about creating a machine that can fold the laundry and then I will do art? This is what the fight for communism is about. that we use the technology and the means of production that we have created for the benefits of the majority, to set free the potential of human minds, of all of us. The prerequisite for that is a change in the ownership of the means of production. But that will create an explosion in art and culture. But as Leila also said, and as we have discussed before, the tool to create that society needs to be fitted for the purpose. We live in this society, we live in capitalism, where a small minority has all the privilege and wealth, and all the means to try to have all the means to defend it, or want to defend it with all means necessary. It is up to us to create the tool to change that, to show them, to throw them to the dustbin of history, because their system has outlived itself, but the foundation for a new system is already here. And it is up to us to realize it, to set humanity free.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you to everybody who participated in the discussion. For those of you participating online, we will meet again at 3. For those of you who are participating here in Italy, please stay seated for a while longer. So I'll see you guys online at 3.